But we're very, very lucky that we've got Garland Nixon, who is our now one and only guest. We'll get back to Colonel McGregor on another occasion, but who, if I'm lucky, is on the line now. Garland, dependable as always, loyal as always. Thank you for waiting this inordinate time. So much is happening this evening. So much is happening in the world. But my mind is fixed on that phone call tomorrow morning, your time, 10 a.m. your time, from Donald Trump to Vladimir Putin. Tell us what you're expecting out of that.
Well, the fact of the matter is, I do not expect a resolution of this conflict anytime soon. The reality is Donald Trump represents the U.S. empire, and the goal of the U.S. empire was the destruction of Russia. Now, Donald Trump has taken over that empire. He may have personal goals that may or may not be identical to the original imperial goals, but he is surrounded by people, and he is surrounded by institutions that still seek to pursue those goals. That being the case, since the goals of the Russian government and the Russian people is to establish a zone of security around that border, I do not see an area where the two of them can come together. In addition to that, the Ukrainian government / the MI6 puppets are reflective of the irrationality of a fascist regime. And I think that the irrational fascist regime is perfectly happy to fight to the death. Many of them are happy to give their lives or the lives of all of their citizens. So I believe, Donald Trump genuinely seeks to pursue an end to this conflict as soon as possible. But I do not believe that he has the means to overcome the institutions that he represents.
No, but he has the ability to say, I'm out of here. There'll be no more American weapons, no more American money, and crucially, no more American satellite intelligence. Might he do that?
Now what you've said, that he has the means to do that, he has the power to do that and the ability to do that, I think we may find that out. Let's not forget that when Donald Trump was in office, in his first term, he literally gave the Pentagon, he gave his underlings the order to remove the troops from Syria, and they refused to do it. They lied to him about the number of troops that were in Syria. So that's, I think rather than say that the president of the United States has the authority and the power to direct foreign policy of the U.S. empire, I think that remains to be seen. I think that at this point, the best that could be hoped for all parties would be specifically for Donald Trump to get out. He might have stayed in a little too long. I think he understands that if he leaves, he gives the neocons the opportunity when the Kiev regime begins to falter and eventually falls to say, well, they would have been fine if Donald Trump simply hadn't have cut off their supply of weapons. So Donald Trump, by sticking around as long as he has put himself in a difficult position. I find it very difficult to believe that Donald Trump will be able to stop this thing. I think the other problem that Donald Trump has, and his problems are not with the Russians. Donald Trump could come up with a deal with the Russians in 5 minutes, word up to him. I think the other problem that he has is that there are people around him, and certainly in Europe, that want these bone-crushing sanctions. Well, one of the things that they would crush would be Donald Trump's approval ratings, because if they were to be effective in any way, they would raise the price of oil, they would increase inflation, and of course, Donald Trump would pay the price for that. So he's in a very difficult position, some of it created by the fact that he didn't move early by doing what he may eventually be put in a position that he has to do in the long run, which is walk away from this thing. So right now, I think we are in a unique position because we're going to learn just how much authority the president of the United States has. Will he be able to do this? I think Donald Trump has said a couple times, we're going to leave, and then pressure would come and he would be forced to backtrack on it. So I think we're going to see how much authority Donald Trump actually has.
This is a fascinating constitutional road you're taking us down here, Garland. Certainly, Donald Trump He has all the authority in the world beyond the constitutional authority of the President of the United States. But you appear to be saying that perhaps he has rather less than he is entitled to, and therefore way less than he thinks he has. So comment to that, please. But also this, when you say he hung around too long, and surely he did, he had the ability to say, this was Biden's war. But now, after all this time, it's in real danger of becoming Trump's war, isn't it?
Yes, I think number one, what I was referring to is when Donald Trump first came in, there was a fervor amongst the MAGA supporters, and not just the MAGA supporters. At that time, Donald Trump had a strong coalition of voters who were not traditional Trump voters, minority voters, and even some centrists who had just had enough anti-war left. A lot of people who weren't traditional would not traditionally vote for Republicans, but they were sick and tired of the Democrats. So he had a mandate to kind of do what he wanted, and they were very anti-war, at minimum anti-Ukraine conflict. And Steve Bannon at that time was saying Donald Trump should just walk away, and the longer he stays, the more he gets tied to the war. So the more he claims that he can end it, the more he tweets about who's right and wrong, the more he becomes entangled in the rhetoric that's related to this mess. And he begins to drive the rhetoric. And it's going to be difficult for Donald Trump to be driving the rhetoric as to who's right and who's wrong, to drive the rhetoric as to the direction that the negotiations are going, and then suddenly say, I have nothing to do with it, I'm out. So I think that that Donald Trump has maybe stuck on a bit too long, and it's going to be his war. I also think that there is probably another sentiment amongst the neocons that they know this thing is going to go bad. And let's face it, they know that ultimately Ukraine, though they may not claim it, that ultimately Ukraine does not have the military wherewithal to defeat Russia, and that when the inevitable eventually happens, they want a scapegoat. And if Donald Trump holds on to this, they have a ready-made scapegoat. Everything was going fine when Joe Biden was there and Donald Trump came in. He messed it up, and then, God forbid, he pulled the rug out from other Ukrainians and stopped giving them intelligence, and that's finally what it was. Otherwise, they could have hung on forever. So he's put himself in a bad situation. But I do think that if Donald Trump pulls the trigger and does something that I'll put it like this, his best move would be act in a way that the mainstream institutions don't want him to act, because that would give him support from his base, number one. And number two, it would put them in a position of having to say, well, we're going to fight Donald Trump and stop him from doing that, or impeach him, or God knows whatever else. It would put the Republicans that have been saying, we love Trump, when really they don't like him at all, when really they're, just institution people and they're system people. It will put them in a position of having to side with him or not. So Donald Trump's in a tough spot. But if he makes a firm decision and pulls the trigger, he can kind of take the situation he finds himself in, and he can reverse that to his adversaries. And to be quite frank, it's going to be hard to attack Donald Trump for any anti-war position, because that will be a very popular position. I'll put it like this. They can attack him on radio and on television, et cetera, but in the streets, in the court of public opinion, an anti-war position will always win in the court of public opinion in the United States.
Now, we've touched tangentially on the last guy. Jake Tapper publishes a book tomorrow, which reveals all, as if you and I haven't talked about this 100 times over the last few years, about the mental state of Joe Biden in the last part, at least, of his presidency. It's very odd, because the very same Jake Tapper and all of his colleagues were telling us that we were engaged in Russian disinformation when we said that Joe Biden had gone soft in the head and was no longer a fit and proper person to be conducting international affairs of such great moment. But now Tapper is releasing what presumably will be a bestseller, in which he reveals that which you and I used to talk about years ago here on the mother of all talk shows. What do we make of that? And what's likely to be in the book?
Well, a couple of things on that. One of the things is that in the last week or so, and it wouldn't surprise me if it wasn't, related to pushing Jake Tapper's book. An audio tape has been released of Joe Biden being interviewed by a special counsel, in which it was not a pretty sight. He stumbled and bumbled. He couldn't remember things, and it was fairly obvious at that point that things were looking bad for Joe Biden, and he didn't know what was going on. What Jake Tapper and the Democrats and all of these people are doing is something that's commonly, I don't know what term they use in British court, but in the American legal community, there's a term commonly known as a creeping admission. A creeping admission being that a suspect will only admit to as much as you can prove. He'll say, "No, I wasn't at the scene of the crime." And if someone says, "Well, we've got videotape," okay, I was there, but I didn't know the suspect. Okay, well, we've got a text between you and the suspect. Okay, I knew him, but I didn't. A creeping admission meaning I'm only going to release as much as you know. So as long as there was no evidence, that you could hold them to that Joe Biden was completely done. They didn't know anything about it. He was great. He was the best Joe Biden we'd ever known. And we were told on MSNBC, they literally said, "F you," if you don't agree or if you don't believe it. And so now it's bad enough that they actually have to admit it. But now Jake Tapper's going to go out and try to make money from it. But if the sales of his book are anything like the numbers of the pundits such as Jake Tapper on CNN, I suspect that they'll have to do like these people usually do, and they buy 25,000 of their own books so they can call it a New York Times bestseller. That's my suspicion. If it becomes a New York Times bestseller, somewhere in someone's basement will be 25,000 copies of that book that they bought so they could get the numbers up for the New York Times.
Finally, what's the fallout, if any, from President Trump's rather vulgar, rather Vegas tour of the Arabian Gulf countries? What's the likelihood of all these trillions? I mean, I think I counted 3 trillions that Donald Trump said that he wheedled out of these Gulf potentates. What's the likelihood of that ending up on the street in the United States in real jobs and real prosperity, in your view?
Well, the people in America are so cynical that nobody, even if it was $50 trillion, Americans understand that even if this money comes to the so-called United States, that it goes into the hands of a few oligarchs, and that the average person on the streets not going to see a penny of it. It'll end up in the Cayman Islands or some, bank account in a country where we can never find out where it went. The actual discussions of that were, number one, the big discussion out of that was the infamous $400 million flying castle plane, and everybody was arguing that, whether that was corruption or not. But then that story was completely overtaken by former Lockheed Martin general counsel and HSBC board member James Comey. So apparently James Comey tweeted this formation of seashells that had the number 8647. So that completely took over the news segments, the news cycle. And of course, the 86 being something that representative of a mafia term, meaning the mafia, you rub somebody out, you take them 8 miles out of town and you put them 6 feet under, right? So 8647 being apparently a threat or an incitement, shall we say, to an assassination of Donald Trump. So in reality, the story about all of the really important stories and segments about the Middle East were overtaken by a James Comey tweet by over a bunch of seashells. And let's face it, in light of the fact that there have been numerous both threats and attempts on the life of Donald Trump, and there are those who may suspect that James Comey I'm not saying anything, may suspect that he and his ilk may have been supporting said acts against Donald Trump. Not saying that in any way that he was involved. It certainly was legitimate to be concerned that James Comey would be tweeting such a thing.
I read somewhere, Garland, that on the day that he tweeted that, it was 8,647 days since the attack on the Twin Towers on 9/11. Have you heard that rather quixotic defense?
No, but keep in mind something. Donald's former law enforcement. I'm very familiar with organized crime. I taught an organized crime class. James Comey is former FBI. They prosecuted organized crime. I know very well it would not be a reasonable argument for me to tweet out that 8647 and say that I didn't know what 86. All you'd have to do is look at maybe some of the books that I've taught out of. It is not plausible for a man who has prosecuted who has prosecuted mafia murders and mafia actions to argue that he didn't know that 86 was. And to put the number 86 with the number of Donald Trump's presidency and not think that someone would suspect that he was up to no good. So based on his history, it's not plausible to argue that he didn't know exactly what that meant.
So the FBI picked him up, questioned him. Are they going to do anything?
I don't think so. I doubt it very, very seriously. The system, it's very embarrassing for the system right now. And I think they understand that it would be kind of destabilizing for the system. There are a lot of people that are very concerned with Kash Patel, who's taken over the FBI, and they were expecting a lot more information regarding the January 6th issue and all of the FBI involvement there. They were expecting more to come out regarding the Crossfire Hurricane, the Russiagate, all of that, and we haven't gotten much of anything. Kash Patel, I think he did do I don't know if it was a press conference, but recently he spoke and said there'd be more coming out next week. Clearly, James Comey and his crew signed off on documents that went to a federal court, the FISA court, knowing that they were lies. That is, it's 17 times, according to an FBI investigation by the Horowitz and the famous Horowitz investigations. So it seems to me hard to look at the actions that were taken in those investigations and not assume that there should be federal charges levied against Christopher Wray and James Comey and numerous others. So if in fact information is released, but the charges are not levied against the people that were involved in these obvious crimes, I think there's going to be problem in MAGA land. Again, there are people that are suspicious right now. The Epstein files and the JFK and all of these things that we were promised are very, very slow to come out. So Donald Trump, I'll put it like this, Donald Trump politically needs a win because a lot of things that he's promised in his first 100 days, he hasn't gotten a real win yet right now. And some of these things would help take the pressure off of Donald Trump. So we shall see. And Kash Patel, who right now is starting to feel a little bit of heat from the MAGA people who are saying they expected more out of him. And is this just a cover up? And is he just going to stand up for the system that was there before him? So, we shall see. But we haven't gotten much yet.